Coming up on Choppers Politics.
Funnily enough, I learnt this off Tom Hanks. I met him once and I was about to shake his hand and he thrust his elbow at me instead and he said, "I've got a cold, I don't want to shake your hand."
Did he? I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Choppers Politics. This week saw the government launch its Fix Your Bike scheme, where you can get £50 bike repair vouchers and GPs will be encouraged to prescribe cycling on the NHS. Now, some are welcoming this increased involvement of the government in our lives, but others are saying they can't bear this form of nanny statism. And we'll be talking to a former Tory cabinet minister about that a bit later. Well, the sun is out, finally, and plenty of us might be thinking about going wild swimming or kayaking on our rivers this weekend. Later on, I'll be talking to Tanni Grey-Thompson, Baroness Grey-Thompson, the former Paralympic hero, about her campaign to open up access to rivers for everybody. A legal right to go wild swimming, if you like. And in a week when local lockdowns loom and thousands of Brits abroad saw their plans to get back and avoid a quarantine scuppered, Lord Matt Ridley gives us 5 reasons to hold on to hope that the end might be in sight. I think we all need that, don't we? But first, this weekend heralds the end of the free BBC TV licence for millions of over 75s, and plenty of Tory MPs are not happy. With me now is the former Cabinet Minister and former Work and Pensions Secretary, Esther McVey. Esther McVey, welcome to Choppers Politics. Good morning, I hope you're well.
I certainly am.
Can I ask you, Esther McVey, what on earth is the BBC doing forcing millions of over 75 to start paying for their licence fee during a pandemic when many of them are socially isolating?
Well, it's a major mistake that the BBC are doing here. Like, you're asking the question, I'm asking the question, the general public's asking the question, but the BBC does not seem to be asking itself the question, why isn't it looking after the most vulnerable people, a group of people that it said it would take responsibility for on the free licence fee in return for getting the licence fee increased with inflation. So it took responsibility for that a while ago, and it has been gradually paying more over a period of time. So at the moment, the BBC is currently paying £450 million towards the £700 million for that free licence fee for the over 75s. And actually what it wants to do from August onwards is reduce that to £250 million. So the real question is, why is the BBC wanting to save £200 million a year on the backs of the over 75 plus? And that's the real nub of the question. It is wrong what it's doing. It should continue with that free licence fee for the over 75s.
Of course, the BBC would say, if they're on this podcast, why should they be funding a universal benefit, a bit like child benefit, when that was claimed by any parent, wasn't it, back in the day before George Osborne got rid of it?
But then it shouldn't have agreed to have taken responsibility for this when it did the negotiations on it some time back. And it's been moving along in this direction. As I said, it's been changing. It was a gradual changeover, but now it's decided it does not want to do it. It is the wrong step for it to be taking, particularly when the public funds it to the tune of £5 billion a year.
Are you surprised by the fact there are no more exceptions? What they've said so far is if you're on benefits, then you'll carry on getting it for free. I think there's, several million who aren't on benefits. So you might have people, for example, with dementia or Alzheimer's who are not on benefits, but, are now at risk of prosecution from Saturday.
And I think this is what now the country will be looking at. Do we get value for our money? Do we need to think about decriminalising the licence? In fact, should we look at subscription for this licence fee? The BBC says it's terrific value for money. Well, if it is, then people will want to subscribe to it. But actually, if you look at it and the journey the BBC's been on now, whereas it used to lead the way, I used to work at the BBC, so I've always been an advocate for it when it was leading the way in sport and leading the way in drama drama and leading the way in documentaries. But actually now it's not. Lots of people would sooner turn to Sky Sport than the BBC. Other people, instead of looking at drama on the BBC, would sooner turn to Netflix. It does need to modernise, show its value for money. And I think now this is the journey it will go on. And I can tell you this by the hundreds upon hundreds of emails I'm getting saying, actually, this BBC isn't what we thought it was. We now need to look at how it is paid for.
What you're describing, a subscription model like Netflix, will mean a massive fall off in revenues, even more than the money they're saving from axing this free license fee.
I'm not saying that, actually. What I'm saying is it needs to be modernised. So if you look at something like, Sky is bringing in more money than the BBC, and I'm saying the BBC brand globally is so held in such high esteem. I actually think that it could do far more. I think it could unleash itself and do far more on that global platform. I think people love the world services if it went back to this journalism, this high quality journalism. And I think it's limiting its own possibilities by continuing with now a form of payment which is out of date.
Isn't it a simpler way of doing it just to make it a civil offence more than a criminal offence?
I think that will be a journey, but I think the way it has acted has got more people looking into the BBC. Is it value for money? Are we watching it? Less people are watching it. You saw between the years of 2018 to 2019, people not actually buying the licence fee because they didn't feel it was value for money. So I actually think the BBC is putting the spotlight on itself and what it delivers.
They will say things like a channel might be at risk, or we can't afford to make these programmes if we carry on with this benefit for the elderly, many of whom are well off.
But I think a lot of people say, but which bit now is public service broadcasting? We see a lot of copycat TV. So you've got The Voice, which was a copy of X Factor. You've got EastEnders, which was a copy of Coronation Street. You've got other programmes that aren't really public service broadcasting. And I think that's where the scrutiny will come.
Your podcast is called Blue Collar Toryism, and you're seen as someone who embodies that, given your background. How do you think the blue-collar Tories view the BBC? Are they obsessed about the issue of bias in the same way that some Tories are?
Well, it's called the podcast called Blue Collar Conversations because it's talking to regular working people up and down the country about the matters that affect them. And actually, on lots of the broadcasting sort of outlets, they probably feel there isn't a voice for them. There could be a voice for the metropolitan elite. There could be a voice for, the establishment. It could be a voice for people talking about themselves. But there isn't one actually understanding what is happening to, just regular folk up and down the country coping with COVID at the moment, what's happening to their jobs, what's happening to their kids' education, what's happening to their freedoms. So it really is talking about that. And I think the blue-collar Conservatives is a very pragmatic, practical Conservative. They are saying, how do we reach out? How do we help? How do we adapt? How do we modernise? How do we cope in the 21st century? So if they're looking at the licence fee for the BBC, they're saying, hang on, is the BBC supporting the people it should be? In this period of a pandemic where over 70s, over 75s could have been shielding, could have been in, weren't allowed to go out, and therefore they've turned to a public service broadcaster, and it's no longer there. They're calling it now the self-serving broadcaster. So they're very much a pragmatic group of people saying, so what should the BBC do going forward?
Away from the BBC, Estimate Vey, do you think that the recent push towards more nanny state policies, such as fitness plans, diet plans, taxpayer-funded bicycling from the government, will that appeal to these red wall voters, these blue-collar Tories, or will they wonder why not vote for Labour instead?
Well, what we believe in, again, going back to that pragmatism understanding, look, explaining to somebody it's healthier to be slim and explaining to people what the survival rates are from COVID if you're obese or if you're not obese. Well, we can listen to that information. We can make judgments and we can go forward. And if you look actually at the public, they have adhered quite strictly and stringently to the information that has been fed. When we were told to shield, yes, we did. When we were told about social distancing, yes, we did. But what we have noticed time after time, this notion of banning things doesn't work. So when you saw that the Labour Party banned adverts for unhealthy food during children's programmes, there was no discernible difference in childhood obesity. So what I'm saying is usually if you find a policy doesn't work and banning and prohibition invariably doesn't work, you say, but what does? So it is about information.
Do you worry then that this government's lost its way? Fourth term Tory government, do you think it's lost its way in terms of what it's for? Because it started out, didn't it, as a government for the individual and supporting the so-called big society and David Cameron, but now it's more of a wagging finger.
Well, what you've got to be careful of, and I believe in freedom of choice. The reason I'm not a socialist, even though I come from Liverpool, which is a very socialist area, is because I don't believe that the state can tell you what to do. I don't believe a one-picture vision works for 60 million people. Different people work differently and adhere differently, and therefore we believe in freedom of choice, freedom of expression, and therefore information giving and support giving is the way forward.
I know what you believe in. Do you think this government's lost its way in terms of moving away from its conservative roots?
Well, when you become very prescriptive, as we have at the moment, so we're banning certain things like 2 for 1, which I don't understand 2 for 1. And yet at the same time, you can say, but here are food vouchers, which you could buy deep fried chicken for, and you will get 2 for the price of 1. You tie yourself up in knots when you become overly prescriptive, which again is why I'm not a socialist and I am a conservative. And can I tell you the biggest issue coming to me at the moment is the fact that people have seen their shopping bills go up by at least 20% per week at the moment. That is a big scandal coming forward.
Why is that? Why is that?
I'm presuming that supermarkets might say, because we've had so much demand, prices have gone up. I don't know. We should be looking into whether that has been profiteering going on at the moment.
Yeah.
So I've got people saying to me, why would you be getting rid of 2 for 1 at the moment when my shopping bill has gone up 20%? So we really need to focus on how do we make it possible for people to afford their weekly shop? What are we going to do going forward to make sure that people can survive, they're getting value for money, they have got the ability to feed their family. And that to me is my number one issue coming through as emails at the moment. So again, when the BBC compound that by giving over 75s a bill, something they said they would take responsibility for, at this moment in time, it shows how completely out of touch they are.
Do you worry that the people who are running the government are a bit too posh to understand what you're describing? For example, I wasn't aware of the shopping basket going up by 20%. In the old days, David Cameron used to walk around with a list of the price of bread and milk in his pocket so he could answer the right question at the right time. Do you think they're a bit out of touch?
No, I think what you've had at the moment, and we can all understand this, we have been in the most extraordinary times, and the government has had to focus on the whole pandemic. And things like the furlough scheme, I have to tell you, people say to me that was unbelievably supportive. That was exactly what we needed. So their focus has been on that. But what we don't need to do, even if it's done with laudable intent, getting the nation fitter and healthier is a wonderful thing to do. And I don't have an issue with that as an ambition and focus. But what we don't do is say, and it's got to be done by cycling. Lots of people don't like to cycle. And obviously getting slim, cycling isn't the silver bullet, or else Boris would have found that a long time ago. He cycled all of his life. And what we don't say is you cannot eat this kind of food or that kind of food. We will ban these adverts when we've shown that banning of adverts didn't work under Labour. So what we don't say is we double down on banning when it's been proved not to work. We need to say, how do we support, help and work with the nation, who are 60 million individuals? Like, I don't eat and never do eat fatty food, but I've got a very sweet tooth. So I myself balance up what I can eat and what I can't eat. I enjoy a bar of chocolate, and if I can get 2 for the price of 1, well, good for me, and I will get that. But there are other things that I don't have. And as my grandma said, Esther, everything in moderation and make sure you've got as many calories being burnt up as you've got consuming. And that is the sort of pragmatic common sense. And then people can see what they can afford, see what they enjoy, and see what kind of exercise they'd like to do. At the moment, lots of people are seeking ways to comfort themselves, actually, because it's been a very stressful time. They might not have seen the loved one. They might not have been able to have a wedding. They might not have been able to have attended a funeral. So at the moment, people are doing some kind of self-soothing and comforting. So now certainly isn't the time to be banning things.
Some homespun wisdom there from Esther McVeigh, the former Work and Pensions Secretary. Esther, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, stick around. In just a moment, we'll be talking about grabbing your goggles and heading for a swim in a river right after this.
Hi there, podcast fan. It's Tom Gibbs here. I'm host of the Telegraph's Audio Football Club podcast. I'm very sorry for interrupting, but I wanted to let you know that football is finally back on the menu, and so is Audio Football Club. We'll be back in your podcast feed every Monday with analysis, chat and sarcasm from Mina Rizuki, JJ Ball, Matt Law and many, many more. Look for Telegraph Audio Football Club wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. Now, as the weather hots up, many of us are planning to take a refreshing dip in a lake or a river. I know David Cameron, the former Tory PM, was a big fan of jumping into lakes and rivers on overseas trips. But you might be surprised to find out just how hard it is to access our rivers and streams, because many landowners don't really want you to. One peer pushing to change this is Tanni Grey-Thompson, Baroness Grey-Thompson, the former Paralympic hero. Tanni Grey-Thompson, welcome to Choppers Politics.
Thank you.
What is the attraction of wild swimming?
Well, swimming is one of the biggest participation sports in the country. You know, over 2 million people in normal times are swimming every week. A huge number of people like swimming open water. I have to say it's not something personally I would like to do, but I'm massively supportive of those who do. And I think for me, with the agriculture bill that the House of Lords have just done, it was about raising it in a different way and getting everyone who's thinking about the environment and sort of through general agriculture legislation to think about better access for everybody. I mean, at the moment, the reality is it's quite difficult for people to access waterways in the UK, and I think that needs to change.
Do you know how much of, I suppose this must be an England issue, I suppose, not a Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland issue, but how much of our waterways are accessible?
It's actually only a tiny percentage. It's a couple of thousand miles. It does get slightly more complicated if you start building in reservoirs and sort of every kind of possible stream. But actually the access is incredibly limited, not just physically getting onto the water. And this also applies, you know, for kayaking, paddleboards, you know, all sorts of water recreation. It's actually getting there, parking, how you access the land, what land you have to walk through to get to the water. So these are things that I guess haven't been typically debated in an agriculture bill before. You're sitting there talking to a lot of farmers and landowners, and actually if they start thinking differently about it, then it's something that's quite important. It's about trying to build a better relationship with the farmers so that they, you know, should receive financial assistance, you know, where they create new paths or take steps to improve accessibility, you know, things like that. And for me as a wheelchair user, it's quite hard to get anywhere near water anyway. So, you know, I'd also like people to think about disability access while they're thinking about this.
Absolutely. So the idea, of course, with this agriculture bill is to build in these public goods into the way grant money is given to farmers. And this idea would be to reward them for creating access paths or lanes down to where the water is to get people swimming in a wild context. That's the idea?
Yeah, it is. And, you know, it's also about getting everyone to think about water quality, wildlife. You know, we've received a little bit of criticism saying people will just go and destroy everything around. But it's about actually educating people about the countryside as well. You know, we should have sort of clean, navigable waterways, but you know, we don't want anybody destroying anything that's already there.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the water sports, you know, teach young children as they sort of come into them about the countryside, about wildlife, and actually a lot of times, they can spot things up and down the rivers that maybe farmers, like flooding, won't necessarily have seen. So, it's finding a way that they can report that back in as well to be helpful, not to hinder.
Do you worry it might be you might open up people who can't really swim that well in wild conditions to risk to their lives?
I think that's the safety issue that open water wild swimming is not for everybody. I know, and so my daughter does some kayaking, and a lot of the access points need to be or are very clearly signed and saying it's an at-risk sport, and there's lots of rules about how you should swim and you should be with other people. So that is a consideration. It's not just saying to everyone, right, here you go, off you go, swim down a river, because you need some skills in doing that. But for those who want to and sort of understand the safety implications, it should be easier than it currently is.
Yeah. Have you been in touch with landowners, the Country Landowners Association or the Countryside Alliance? Are they happy with this?
No, I haven't been directly in touch with them. I came to the bill quite late. I imagine that there's lots of different views on this. Very happy to have a conversation with anyone. And when we were debating it in the chamber, there was pushback, which is fine. That's part of the debate. I think, looking at the other side, I can see why farmers wouldn't want hundreds of people tramping through their lands and sort of causing disruption. So in the give and take of the House of Lords politics, we have lots of different diverse opinions that hopefully will come to an arrangement that suits most people. And it's not saying to farmers they have to, it's saying, you should. Yes,
I imagine there's a lot of landowners in the House of Lords, but we'll move on from that. But so a legal right to wild swim. I mean, I can see why that might be attractive to anyone worried. I mean, wild swimming is good for mental health. We know that. It's good for health itself. It's just good to be near water. We're an island nation. We like water. That's why the Victorians built fountains.
There's something that is very calming about being near water, the sound of it. On a beautiful summer's day, there is nothing that's more perfect. I haven't spent a lot of time with my daughter kayaking, when it's -5 and they're breaking the ice to get on. It's not so pleasant. Swimming, kayaking, paddleboard, all those things encourage sort of a connection with nature, mental health and well-being. There's lots of really good things about sport that is less organised and less formal, as well as the formal side. So, I'm hoping we get a little bit of movement. If not, I hope that we've at least opened up people's eyes to thinking about the wider implications and what farmers could make this happen in a really positive way. And we hope they at least think differently about it. We're not saying that any of this has to be sort of lifeguarded or protected. People need to understand the risk that they're taking. In terms of kayaking, the advice has always been 3 people go together, you don't go less than 3. So there's lots of advice around about how you should do that. And this is kind of the start. We've never, in sort of the time that I've been in the Lords, never been talking about sport and physical activity in legislation quite like this. So, for me, it was sort of quite debating with a very different group of people than I normally debate with. And so that's been sort of interesting. We just have to be in sport and physical activity. We have to be a bit more connected with lots of different parts of legislation, I think, and think creatively. And, also, a lot of people during lockdown have said, they really, really miss swimming. Swimming's, a huge sport for older people, for actually pools in terms of teaching youngsters to swim. So swimming is a really, really important of people's daily lives.
Yes, of course. We're a month away from the date when the Paralympics would have started, Tanni Grey-Thompson. It's sad it's delayed by a year. How are you feeling about this? You'll miss it, won't you? Your every 4-year fix of sports and given how decorated you are.
It's slightly weird, my whole life is based on 4-year cycles, and now having a games in an even year is going to be a bit weird, but it was the right decision to take at the time. And I think the athletes needed clarity. It's going to change the games in terms of there have been athletes just hanging on for their final year. There might be athletes who make the team that were too young, weren't developed enough this year. So I think it's going to change how the medals get won. But the athletes that come out of it strongest will be the ones who've been able to cope with training in quite a different way, especially for those who are sort of based in centralised programmes. But I think it was, at the point the decision was taken, I think people were saying, are you sure, it might be sorted by then, but you look back now, it was the absolute right decision to postpone.
Well, Tanni Grey-Thompson, thank you so much for joining us this week on Choppers Politics, and best of luck with your attempt to give us a legal right to wild swim. Why not? Thank you.
Thank you.
And if that's encouraged you to grab your goggles and rush the river, There's a great article in the Telegraph right now about England's top 20 best wild swimming spots, from rivers to waterfalls to tidal pools. I'll put a link to that in the show notes of this episode. Now, it's easy to get miserable with news about the R numbers rising across Europe and increased numbers of hotspots of coronavirus in Britain. And my next guest knows that, but equally he thinks there are some cautious reasons to be optimistic. Matt Ridley, Lord Ridley, joins me now on Choppers Politics. Now, Matt, you wrote a rather interesting piece about why the coronavirus might be over soon in last weekend's Telegraph. Can you enlighten the listeners of Choppers Politics about the 5 reasons why this might be the case?
Well, soon is. I wouldn't want people to misunderstand soon. It's not going to be over in the next few weeks. It may well not be over by the end of the year, but sometime by the spring, certainly, not certainly, but probably, I think there are good reasons to think that we will have licked this problem. And although it won't have gone away globally, we will be in a much clearer situation. I gave 5 reasons for that optimism. One is the vaccine development. Those trials of the Oxford and AstraZeneca vaccine were very promising. They look like it's both effective and safe. Of course, we need to know whether it's still safe in elderly people and things like that. And even if that one doesn't work, there are so many other vaccine candidates coming down the line that I think it's now far more likely than not that one of them will be workable and available by the middle of the winter, certainly.
At scale, do you think at scale, will it be available, but will there be enough of it?
Well, obviously, manufacturing at scale takes time, and I think that, not everybody will have it by Christmas, as it were. But this actually gets to my second reason for optimism, is that you only start to need to vaccinate a relatively modest proportion of the population before you're starting to give the virus nowhere to go, because it looks like the rate of spread of the virus had peaked before lockdown and was already declining. And if you combine that with our knowledge of immunity now, we now know that a big proportion of the population, possibly more than half the population, can't catch this virus, or generally doesn't catch it, because they're already immune to other coronaviruses, the ones that cause common colds.
Right.
Then it means that herd immunity is much easier to reach than we thought. Sunitra Gupta at Oxford University has suggested that we only need 20% of the population to have either had the virus or had the vaccine before we've got herd immunity.
Okay. Third reason?
My third reason is that we have started social distancing measures, and even if we don't continue with the compulsory ones or full lockdowns, we are, by continuing these measures, making it hard for the virus to spread. So if we're not shaking hands, if we're washing our hands, if we're wearing a face mask... You and I are not over our usual table in the Red Lion, are we, Matt? Well, exactly. If we were at the Red Lion, we'd be eating each other's spit.
Yes. Oh, God, what a thought.
I put it rather crudely, but do you know what I mean? There's always that risk. So I think actually, with a modest amount of sensible measures, we can make it very hard for this virus to spread. After all, look what happened. We had huge protests and mass gatherings from June onwards, and we have not seen much of a spike in cases. We've seen 1 or 2. Well,
the Tobias with the MP for Bournemouth, sorry to cut across you, has told me that there's been no increase in infections in Bournemouth, despite those images of the crowded beach, if you remember, on the first weekend of the semi-release of lockdown. Do you remember that?
Exactly. That beach was a spectacular sight, although I don't know what you can do with telephoto lens to make it look worse than it was. But of course, beaches should be okay, because this virus doesn't like the outdoors. It doesn't like ultraviolet light. It doesn't like wind, which blows it away. And so we were always wrong to tell people to stay indoors, in my view. We should have, in that sunny April, we just said, get outdoors as much as you like.
Get
Go
outdoors.
to the Peak District.
Yeah. Sunbathe. Don't get told off for sunbathing.
My fourth reason is that the reason we had a really bad death toll in this country was because we let the virus get into the hospitals and care homes. And we did that because we underestimated the importance of asymptomatic spreading. And so we said that you only need to go and get a test if you've got symptoms, and you only need to isolate if you've got symptoms. And then we said, oh, by the way, we haven't got enough tests, so we're not even going to test people with symptoms. We stopped testing in March. It was a disastrous mistake. And we also said, by the way, there's going to be such a wave of people coming into hospital that we should clear out all patients who can just about walk and send them to care homes if they're elderly. Well, that means we sent a ton of virus into the care homes, and we won't do that again. We have learnt that lesson.
And the reason they gave to us, of course, was they didn't have enough testing at scale to be worth doing.
Yeah, but the reason for that was because, the private sector was screaming its head off, saying, look, we can ramp up testing. We know how to do it. And Public Health England was saying, no, we don't trust you to get it right. We want to keep everything within the Soviet system called the National Health Service. And we don't believe in the private sector. I'm sorry, but that's a strong way of putting it. But if you look at countries like Germany, which do a lot of testing in the private sector for lots of diseases routinely. They have a system of social insurance which goes out and buys the best tests. We should have done that in this country.
Right, so in summary, we've learned the lesson is your fourth reason to be a bit cheerful. It's been a grim lesson to learn, but we've learnt it.
Yeah, fourth is we've learnt that lesson. So although you're seeing spikes in cases in various countries and places in the world at the moment, you're not seeing spikes in deaths. And I think that's wise, because we are at least keeping it from being a nosocomial disease, that is to say, a hospital-acquired infection. So the fifth reason is treatment. We've got dexamethasone to save the lives of people who are really ill. That was an important breakthrough. We've got other antivirals, including remdesivir, but we're also learning simply how to handle people in hospital. Turns out ventilators were not saving lives very well, might have even made the problem worse. Lying people on their front helped rather than on their back, we now know. Thrombosis is a problem. This virus tends to affect the vascular system, the blood system, and people get clots and strokes. So having on hand drugs to treat that, and also ways to treat the immune system, because there is the cytokine storm, the immune overreaction, which also causes. So I think that even if people get very ill, they're less likely to die from now onwards. So all those are 5 reasons why I think, yes, we will have some kind of a resurgence when the weather gets cooler and we spend more time indoors and we've relaxed our measures. But I don't think it will be anything like as bad as the first wave. And I think there's every reason to think that it might peter out quite quickly, and that hopefully by Christmas and probably by Easter, we will be able to say that problem has basically gone away. We can go back to absolutely normal. Except there's one respect in which I don't want to go back to absolutely normal, and that is that I asked Professor Peter Pio in a parliamentary hearing whether he thought that the changes that we've done in our hand washing and things like that might be permanent. And he said, well, we may, possibly handshaking is gone for good.
Yeah, gosh.
And actually, I argued for that right back in February. I said, I wrote an article about having had an ordinary cold in January, which I did. I don't think it was coronavirus. I'm 90% sure it was an ordinary cold. But I deliberately cut out a whole ton of social engagements out of my diary, and I absolutely refused to shake hands with people, which is quite difficult in those days. It's easier now, but people stretch out their hand, you're about to shake it, and then you suddenly remind yourself, no, I shouldn't be doing this because I might give them a cold. Funnily enough, I learnt this off Tom Hanks. I met him once about 5 years ago, and I was about to shake his hand, and he thrust his elbow at me instead, and he said, I've got a cold, I don't want to shake your hand.
Did he?
And he probably didn't have a cold, he just didn't want to get one off a stranger. But I thought, good for him, why not?
But Matt, the handshake's so important. It's part of it's how we measure someone, by the firmness of a handshake. It means something in this country to shake hands.
Yeah, but we can learn to map all of that meaning onto the namaste gesture. I love this, praying hands gesture that you bow slightly as you put your hands in a praying. That's how, when I was living in India once years ago, that's how I learned to greet people. You don't shake hands in India. You just put your hands together in a praying thing and you say namaste. So let's do that. I think that would be a great innovation.
So it's the end of shaking on it. That could be the legacy of COVID-19.
No, actually, that's not the problem, because think how many out-of-date things remain in our language. Hoist by your own petard means blown up by your own bomb when you're trying to get into a medieval castle.
Okay. Let's stop doing that. Good idea. Okay. Well, Matt Ridley, it's been great to talk to you. Lord Ridley, we'll put a link to this excellent 5 reasons to be cheerful or not as sad about COVID-19 into the show notes of this podcast. Thank you once again for coming on. Terrific fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
And that's all for this week. Thank to my guests, Esther McVeigh, Baroness Grey-Thompson, and of course, Lord Ridley there. Thank to my producers, Louisa Wells and Elliot Lampitt, and my editor, Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening and leaving reviews. They really help other people find this podcast and even boost us up the podcast charts. That can't be bad, can it? And don't forget, in the show notes of this episode, we'll be leaving links to the 20 best places to go while swimming in England, and also that link to Matt Ridley's 5 reasons to be optimistic about the pandemic. And if this podcast has left you curious about more top-notch Telegraph journalism, please go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you can get 30 days free access to all our best content completely free of charge. And please do get in touch. Email me, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or tweet me @chopperspolitics. And always buy your copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time, cheerio!